Good morning, good afternoon, distinguished guests, colleagues. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on nitrogen challenges in agri-food systems, halve nitrogen waste by 2030, organized jointly by FAO and UNEP as the implementation of the FAO-UNEP Memorandum of Understanding, which was recently amended and extended until 2024. This webinar is the first of a series of webinars that will be organized in the context of this Memorandum of Understanding to promote sustainable nitrogen management through science and policy. I would like to thank FAO and UNEP colleagues that have contributed to the organization of this webinar. Nitrogen is essential for agri-food systems. In its reactive form, nitrogen has a cascade effect and is emitted at each stage of the process of the production. The Haber-Bosch process has revolutionized agriculture with the industrial production of ammonia used for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which has resulted in much higher crop yields than previous. Biological nitrogen fixation is also essential for agricultural production, in particular in countries with low access to synthetic fertilizer. Scientific evidence, however, shows that more than 80% of the nitrogen applied on land is lost to the environment in various forms, as nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas, as ammonia and nitrogen oxides, which contribute to air pollution, and as nitrates, which cause water pollution, resulting in freshwater and marine eutrophication. The objective of this event is to raise awareness about the nitrogen challenges and potential technical solutions and policies in agri-food systems, and highlight the ongoing efforts to better manage nitrogen. The event will provide an opportunity to learn about the multiple roles of nitrogen in agri-food systems and on how different stakeholders can contribute to sustainable nitrogen management. This webinar is structured in 3 parts. First, we will set the scene with our distinguished speakers who will give their opening remarks and thoughts on sustainable nitrogen management. Second, we will dive into a scientific discussion of the recent evidence on nitrogen challenges, technical solutions, and policies. This session will be followed by a 20-minute question and answers. Finally, we will have a panel discussion on problems and solutions for sustainable nitrogen management. Before I give the floor to our distinguished guests, I just would like to remind you of a few house rules. Microphones of participants will be deactivated throughout the webinar. Please write your questions in the chat box. Some will be selected to be answered during the dedicated question and answer session. Questions that are not addressed during the webinar will be collected and answered in written form afterwards. The webinar will be recorded and the recording will be published online afterwards. To set the scene for this webinar, we have invited 4 distinguished speakers to officially give opening remarks. To welcome participants on behalf of FAO, I would like to introduce Mr. Eduardo Mansour, Director of the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at FAO, and invite him to give us his opening remarks. The floor is yours, Eduardo.
Good afternoon, Henning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening for those far in the east, and good morning for those in the west. It's an excellent opportunity to join here on behalf of FAO to welcome you on this on behalf of the organization. And at the forefront, I would like to thank the colleagues from the Animal Production and Health Division for the initiative. The topic is extremely timely, extremely important, and fits very nicely on the activating the activities under the FAO-UNEP Memorandum of Understanding. We are here in the webinar to discuss nitrogen challenge in the agri-food systems, how to halve nitrogen waste by 2030, And it's a delight to organize this in partnership with our sister agency, the United Nations Environment Program, the UNEP. I hope that we are all safe during this COVID period. The pandemic has brought to us hardship, difficulties in our work, in our environment, but I also hope that this new experience, this new reality can trigger positive change in the long term, especially if we look at building back better in our agri-food systems and the environment. There is a clear call for a green growth, for a return to green alternatives when we talk about the recovery from the current situation of the pandemic. And the sustainable management of nitrogen with the challenge that it presents is adamant for the success of this rebuild and for our fight for the different environmental issues, including on climate change. So this webinar comes in the right moment, because here in FAO, we are currently discussing the new strategic framework that will be based for our future work in the future years. We are looking at accelerators, we are calling this way, on technology, on innovation, on data, on governance, on human capital, on institutions, based on 4 aspirations that FAO has defined as its way ahead for better production, better nutrition, better environment towards better lives, better livelihoods. So sustainable nitrogen management in the agri-food system is in line with, especially with better production, but also with a better environment that we are looking at. And the use of reactive nitrogen in agriculture and food production, which has greatly contributed to food security, nutrition, and livelihoods because of a growing population, requires technological innovation to synthesize ammonia at the industrial level to boost crop production, and this has happening in the last decades. It has also contributed to livestock production in different countries, to the production of highly nutritious feed. But unfortunately, we experience a large inequality in access of synthetic fertilizers, for instance, on the use, on the management of these resources. Just to illustrate, our database FAO-Stat identified that 95% of synthetic fertilizers are used in 50 countries in the planet, while the rest of the world is left with little access to nitrogen fertilizers, limiting crop and animal production. We know that COVID-19 pandemic has increased this gap, resulting in great challenge for food security and for poverty reduction. While the agri-food systems make a crucial contribution to the global food supply, to the economy, to livelihoods, they are also major emitters of reactive nitrogen into the environment, which is causing impacts on climate change, on air and water pollution, on acidification and eutrophication, as well as in landscapes and in seascapes. We all know that the continuous emissions of reactive nitrogen into the environment from changing agri-food systems, fueled by economic opportunities, rising incomes, and urbanization, changing food habits, have altered the nitrogen cycle and transgressed the planetary boundaries threshold. I think everybody knows that we are, for the level of consumption and contamination we have, the planet should be much bigger. That's what we mean by transgressing the planetary boundaries. It's the ecological boundaries that we're talking here, and the sustainability boundaries. So nitrogen is also considered in the climate change agenda, as you know, and there is a landmark decision at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change related to agriculture, the Coronivia decision, the joint work on agriculture, where nitrogen is directly related to topics like improved soil carbon, soil health, soil fertility under grassland and cropland, as well as in integrated systems, including water management. and on the topic related to improve nutrient use and manure management towards sustainable and resilient agricultural systems. Also, Coronivia mentions the need for improved livestock management systems, including agropastoral production system, which is considered since the adoption of the decision. FAO is working hard with member countries to implement, to give life to the Coronivia joint work of the UNFCCC, because there is an urgency with which nitrogen threats must be mitigated while preserving the livelihoods of the hundreds of millions of people, requiring strong policies and the commitments. Sustainable nitrogen management requires the implementation of technical solutions, of policies across the agricultural value chains. So FAO supports the adoption of the UNEA, the United Nations Environmental Assembly resolution on sustainable nitrogen management. That resolution recognized the importance of global coordination and collaboration to tackle the nitrogen challenge across landscapes and seascapes. At our 41st FAO conference, the conference endorsed the International Code of Conduct for the Sustainable Use and Management of Fertilizers, for all types of fertilizers, which highlights guidelines to ensure sustainable use and management of synthetic and organic manure for food security and nutrition, soil health, as well as the protection of our environment. That guideline has been developed in a very participatory way, including the different stakeholders that are interested on the topic, has been facilitated by the Global Soil Partnership. Technical solutions and evidence-based policies to improve nitrogen management require relevant data and methods, as well as the development of information systems. So FAO, through the Livestock Environmental Assessment and Performance, the LEAP partnership, has developed the guidelines on nutrient flows and associated environmental impacts in livestock supplies that provides comprehensive methods and metrics to measure the magnitude of nitrogen use and emissions and its associated impacts. I think different stakeholders, including, of course, UNEP through the Global Partnership on Nutrient Management, the GPNM, that have contributed to the work of this particular work of LEAP. As I mentioned already, two partnerships, strong partnerships are needed with governments, with private sector, with academia, with other partners, civil society organizations. That's essential to address the several challenges affecting agri-food systems, including access and management of nitrogen. It's using. We have to access by all means tools, mechanism available to us, because there has not yet sufficient discussion and knowledge around this issue. Nitrogen management is the responsibility of multiple sectors, should not be addressed in silos. And FAO is keen to work with you on this. All stakeholders being involved in sustainable nitrogen management, enhancing forms of collaboration this is a need to be implemented. FAO will continue to support our members in different initiatives, including the ones I mentioned, the Global Partnership on Nutrient Management, the Global Soil Partnership, and towards international nitrogen management systems, the INMS, to ensure sustainable nitrogen and agri-food systems. While not addressing directly, sustainable nitrogen management is a cross-cutting issue and can contribute to achieving most of the targets related to environment, to agri-food systems under the Sustainable Development Goals. We are all needed, we need to work together, we need to work harder to address this challenge and to move towards sustainable and inclusive agri-food systems, while we need also to better understand and minimize the trade-offs that exist between different policies and objectives. I'm sure that this webinar will bring us to a new level of shared knowledge and action towards these important issues that are related to the challenge that nitrogen use and management put to agri-food systems. We hope that we will all achieve the ambition to halve nitrogen waste by 2030, cutting it by half. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Well, FAO is delighted to join UNEP in the organization of this event and to have your presence here. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo, for outlining the challenge, for also highlighting the changing strategic context within FAO, and for your encouragement to tackle these important, complicated challenges. May I now give the floor to Ms. Leticia Carvalho to welcome participants on behalf of UNEP. Ms. Leticia is the head of the Freshwater, Marine and Coastal Ecosystems branch at the United Nations Environment Programme. Over to you, Leticia.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear and listen. I hope you can see and hear from me.
We can hear you well. Thank you.
Excellent. So welcome all participants. It seems that we are now over 700 registered to this first joint webinar between FAO and UNEP on nitrogen challenges in agri-food systems to halve nitrogen waste by 2030. It is excellent to see this joint webinar as a tangible partnership towards implementation of the UNEP resolution on sustainable nitrogen management, and also the Colombo Declaration, which was adopted in October 2019, which calls for an ambition to halve nitrogen waste by 2030. Many of you must have heard the UN Secretary General landmark speech on the state of the planet last week during the World Leaders Forum at Columbia University. He highlighted the fact that humanity is waging a war on nature, and that nature always strikes back. He also set the stage for dramatically scaling up our ambition over the coming years. He mentioned that we are facing numerous environmental challenges. Climate change is rapidly hitting the planet. The last 5 summers have been the hottest on record. Air pollution, mainly from burning fossil fuels, kills 7 million people prematurely every year. And land degradation is harming the well-being of 2/5 of humankind while destroying biodiversity at alarming rates. To add to this list is another major threat, nitrogen. The bad news, unfortunately I have some, is that the nitrogen problem has so far received little attention outside scientific circles. The good news, fortunately I also have, is that in addressing it, we can significantly roll back the damage from these 3 challenges: climate change, air pollution, and land degradation. Why does nitrogen matter so much? Without nitrogen, there would be no life on Earth, no chlorophyll, no hemoglobin, no plants or animals. Carbon provides the basic skeleton of organic matter, but it is nitrogen that allows that matter to take on different formats and roles. Nitrogen is why the sky is blue. The atmosphere is stable. Nitrogen is everywhere and yet invisible. Humanity's very existence depends on nitrogen. Over time, we have learned how to harness its power. Pulling nitrogen from the air and fixing in the soil is one reason why the human population has expanded so rapidly. The huge increase of food in food production during the Green Revolution would not have been possible without nitrogen fertilizer. Yet, its usefulness has come at a terrible cost. Our failure to use nitrogen efficiently is polluting our land, air, and water. It is no doubt that food systems play a central role in all societies and are fundamental to ensuring sustainable development, food security, poverty alleviation, and adequate nutrition. However, our food systems are under increasing pressure to respond to numerous and complex challenges of feeding the world population, estimated to grow to 9 billion by 2050. The use of nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus is key to growing crops and thus to the world food security. However, in some parts of the world, as Eduardo just mentioned, farmers do not have access to enough nutrients to grow crops and feed growing populations. while in other parts, there is an excess of nutrients with profound impacts on the environment. We need, as a global community, to address this asymmetry in all means. The upcoming 2021 United Nations Food Systems Summit offers, amongst others, an opportunity to address these nitrogen challenges through the transformation of agri-food systems. We need to look at the designing policies to support the integration of crop and livestock production and to incentivize farmers on the adoption of best management practices, can also enhance nitrogen use efficiency and reduce pollution in agri-food systems. All of these actions have to be connected, dear friends. In conclusion, we will need to work together to build a coherent policy framework that addresses every stage of the nitrogen cycle, improving the performance of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, increase the use of the organic fertilizers, and boosting the recycling of nutrients from agriculture. To quote the UN Secretary General again, we need to act with urgency, with hope. I look forward to our continued partnership with FAO on this important issue on sustainable nitrogen management, especially through the GPA, Global Partnership on Nutrient Management, which I invite all of you to join. I wish you all interesting discussions during this webinar. Thank you very much for your attention. Over.
Thank you, Leticia, for these encouraging words, clearly also mentioning that it's not the only threat associated with agri-food systems, but certainly one of the neglected areas, maybe because it is cross-cutting, that no one feels in charge. Now, can I turn to our next speaker, who is Honorable Mahinda Amareva, the Minister of the Environment from Sri Lanka. He will give his keynote speech via a pre-recorded video message. Can we play the video, please?
Sorry, Henning, we had a last-minute change. We need to give the floor first to the ambassador, and I will play the video afterwards.
Okay, then we play the video afterwards. Can I then ask the ambassador of the Netherlands, Hans Hogewind, to give his remarks, please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Eduardo, Mansour, good to see you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and perhaps good night. It's great to have so many participants in this webinar, and I think it's crucial that FAO and UNEP together are not only organizing this webinar, but have now a memorandum of understanding how to tackle the problem or the challenges of nitrogen. And of course, we know our challenges. I think the COVID-19 has plunged the world into the biggest crisis of recent history. And this kind of crisis has come on top of other crises and challenges, like more than 700 million people affected by hunger, 2 billion people without access to safe, affordable and nutritious food, and 1.6 billion people living with obesity. And we know our challenges when we look to 2030 and 2050, because we have to feed 10 billion people in 2050. So it means also that we have to increase our agricultural productivity. But we cannot do it in the same manner as we are doing now. Because when you look to nitrogen, we know that we have an enormous challenge. We know, of course, that increasing agricultural productivity cannot go without nitrogen, but we have to do it in a much smarter way. We have known that, of course, for a long time that using nitrogen as fertilizer is great for farming to increase productivity. But we also know that it has become also a problem for water, biodiversity, sustainable land use, and our natural resources. So we have to tackle the problem. And science and research clearly highlighted the central role of combining different policies in order to achieve a sustainable result. And that's one of the reasons why we need a science-based approach. And it needs also the priority in policies of government, not only looking to agriculture, but also looking to climate change and the environment. And the Netherlands has seen the problems with an overuse of nitrogen. And it has affected not only our productivity, but also our nature management and biodiversity. And I think we know the challenges and we know that we have solutions. And I think that's also important to acknowledge. Our science and research have given us solutions to tackle the problem of nitrogen. For example, it was already mentioned, the use of chemical fertilizers in a more holistic approach, avoiding as much as possible chemical fertilizers and using organic fertilizers. It's everything to do with better managing livestock waste. It has everything to do with agriculture precision possibilities, innovations which are there for climate smart agriculture. If we have those solutions, why are they not yet in practice? And I think there we have to tackle a problem as well, because we have to make sure that we give the farmers access to innovations and access to the new technologies. Otherwise, it will for them be impossible at the national level, at the local level, to tackle the problems of the fertilizers, to tackle the problem of overuse of nitrogen. And it also means that we have to build capacities with farmers, but also capacities in the value chain. Because one of the things which are related, which perhaps is not directly in our minds when we speak about the overuse of nitrogen, is also food waste. In Africa, we're losing more than 75% of our produced food directly after or before or after harvesting. Think about not wasting that food. That means a lot of saving when it comes to nitrogen. So I think these are possibilities which we have to look into. And it's also necessary, of course, for governments to set up not only, I would say, action programs for managing in a sustainable way nitrogen, but also monitoring the implementation of those programs. For example, within the European Union, the 27 member states have introduced at national level a monitoring scheme so that we can measure and monitor the use of nitrogen and the use of fertilizers. And I think that's a basic tool for managing, sustainably managing our nitrogen use, but also to see what it will do with biodiversity and the environment. And of course, when we speak about sustainably managing nitrogen, one of the main obstacles is, of course, finance, access to finance. And also there are challenges, because I always think not in problems, but in solutions. And we need inclusive financing for smaller farmers. It means that they can produce much more sustainable and much more in an environmental way if they can have access to finance, because access to finance gives them also the possibility to get access to the new information, new innovations, and access to technology. And it's there where we have, not only as government, but also as the international community, as FAO, as UNEP, have to have support, have to help the farmers to get that inclusive financing. And we have the funds available. Think about the climate change, Green Climate Fund and JEF. Those funds are available, and FAO and UNEP stands ready to support countries to access those funds. We have the Adaptation Fund, which is now there. We have the funds of the World Bank, FAO and EFAD. We have to support farmers to get access to those funds. And it's everything about science, it's everything about priority of governments, for example, in the national determined contributions in the climate change arena, to make sure that we come to the national level, that we get to the farmers and give them the possibilities to produce in a sustainable way. And I compliment FAO and UNEP for this excellent webinar. And I hope that this is a beginning of a change, a very much needed change to sustainably manage nitrogen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hogewind, for these excellent remarks and for highlighting also the importance of practice change and change at the level of practitioner and farmers. I think we are ready now for the video address by the Minister of Environment from Sri Lanka, Mahinda Amarawira. Are we ready with the video?
Yes.
Ayubowan, dear friends, it's a privilege for me to address you as a Minister of Environment.
Pascal, we are not seeing the video. We are seeing your screen.
Okay, sorry, 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, now?
Yes, please.
Ayubowan, dear friends, it's a privilege for me to address you as a Minister of Environment. All of us gathered here today are placed in the common platform for serving this planet, saving this planet from our own geoengineering misuse, greed, and selfishness. It is our duty to hand over this home in its purity to the lives of next centuries. It comes with a huge responsibility. Is it possible for me to shoulder this responsibility alone? No, we must all join hands, members of the UN family, members of civil society organizations, and we all as members of this Blue Planet family, to arms of the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the United Nations Environment Programme have proved today that unity can offer something beyond individual attempt. Nitrogen. To one, it seems just another word from an encyclopedia, but when you get closer and have a more explanatory look at nitrogen, like we did during the Nitrogen for Life event in Colombo last year, nitrogen has multiple layers, like a big tree having multiple layers, multiple functions, and with roots spread, yet invisible. Nitrogen embodies every creature on this planet in ways we are yet to identify. Over the years, I have realized that the phenomenon which made us grave in history are no exception from nitrogen spy. The drug business, the fertilizer and seed monopoly, the weapon industry, all stem from this one thing called nitrogen. As my president, His Excellency Gotabaya Rajapaksa, at the Biodiversity Summit of the 75th United Nations General Assembly said, we must better manage nitrogen, ensuring the sustenance of humans. I am pleased to note the UNEP Working Group on Nitrogen, First International Nitrogen Assessment, and the Colombo Declaration on Sustainable Nitrogen Management, all of which contributing to cascade UNEP for resolution on sustainable nitrogen management through the science, policy, and political regimes. You may agree with me that waterways are like blood of this planet. The faster water flows across the ground, the lesser it infiltrates. Similarly, the ambition of halving nitrogen waste must be channeled gradually, strategically, and with clear steps to the implementation and regulatory channels benefiting the life on this planet. Agriculture is one key sector which can apply an iceberg effect towards our ambition. In my country, we have relied for centuries on two major cropping seasons. These seasons were based on monsoon rain, solar radiation, and the moon calendar, where nature itself was the best nitrogen fertilizing agent. Unfortunately, the cropping calendar had been altered for last few decades. Nature's purity from soil to food had been degraded while polluting the planet with synthetic nitrogen overflows. To reach our nitrogen waste ambition, I believe that there are two key strategies. One is to realign cropping seasons to the natural nitrogen flush. The other is to increase fertilizer use efficiency during off-cropping seasons. At a time when the world wastes more than 1 billion tons of food every year, and in the light of UN Food System Summit 2021, may I invite two best UN arms, FAO and UNEP, to explore the potential of mainstreaming these strategies to the global development agenda. Before I conclude, let me appreciate the efforts of the organizers and scientists who support our efforts. I wish this forum a success and best wishes. Thank you, Ayubowan.
Thank you to the Minister of Sri Lanka for highlighting and championing the nitrogen challenge, and thanks to all our distinguished speakers for their excellent remarks. I would now like to invite Professor Ramesh Ramchandran, who is the chair of the Global Partnership on Nutrient Management at UNEP, to take the floor and moderate the next session. Over to you, Professor Ramesh.
Good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, Mr. Henning Senford, for the introduction, and all the opening speakers who have given a very nice introduction about the nitrogen. As you know that we have just an hour to go for this keynote presentations, and we have lined up 5 important speakers for this session. And I think there will be, during this presentation, there will be a lot of questions which we may like to ask. I would like to ask the participants to write down in the chat box their questions, and maybe towards the end of their address, we can ask some of the key points which is raised during their presentation. And later on, if something is not possible to address everybody, we can also give the answers at the end of the, maybe after the seminar is over. So out of these 5 speakers, now I'll call upon Professor Mark Sutton, and he is our first presenter. He is going to talk about nitrogen science support for the environment and sustainable development. And Mark, as you know, that is very well known. We call him as Mr. Nitrogen, and he is the director of the UNEP GEF International Nitrogen Management System, as well as the director of the South Asia Nitrogen Hub, and many other positions he has. Mark, I welcome you to give a speech. It's about 48 minutes is allotted.
Thank you, Ramesh, and good morning, good evening, everybody. Can you confirm, Ramesh, that you can see my screen?
Yeah, you can view this better. I mean, make it a full view.
You should see that full view now. Can you see the full view?
Yeah, now it's fine.
Thank you, Ramesh. So good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about nitrogen science support for environment and sustainable development. You can see on the screen the great flush of different partner organizations. It's illustrating clearly how nitrogen is something that concerns us all. You're very familiar, I'm sure, with this planetary boundary diagram. It's highlighted how the nitrogen boundary is way out of kilter, and there's much more nitrogen on the planet than is needed for sustainable ecosystems. How much it's exceeded, of course, is still a matter of scientific engagement. And of course, there's local and global variation. But essentially, we are changing the planet. We've been packing in all this Haber-Bosch and other nitrogen into the world. And of course, the world is changing as a result. You think about us feeding ourselves, think about how we are feeding the planet, force feeding the planet. And I think this image captures that nicely. So that's the challenge. And why nitrogen? Air quality, climate, water quality, soil quality, biodiversity, all of these issues are linked. And of course, it's a major resource. All of that nitrogen pollution added up, if you multiplied it by the fertilizer price, amounts to about 200 billion US dollars per year that's wasted. And that's in addition to all the health, ecosystem, climate costs. This is just the hard cash. So if we manage nitrogen better, we get a hit on all of these issues. And of course, here's someone who wants to grow his azolla fern. This is what he's holding here for biological nitrogen fixation. He wants to manage nitrogen better. It's about livelihoods. Well, on the Sustainable Development Goals, you can make a narrative and you can study this diagram at your leisure, but essentially you can make a nitrogen argument in relation to every one of the Sustainable Development Goals. Through the launch of the Nitrogen for Life campaign on the sustainable nitrogen management in Colombo, we've really been pushing this forward, this discussion, and it builds on the United Nations Environment Assembly, looking towards a goal to halve nitrogen waste, saving $100 billion a year. And the concept of halve nitrogen waste was only launched in 2018 by the International Nitrogen Initiative. Within 1 year, the Colombo Declaration has embraced that ambition. Here we are today, taking it further. And I'm very pleased to see, for example, in the European Union, their farm to fork strategy, biodiversity strategy are embracing the 2030 goal to halve nitrogen waste. They're reframing it as nutrient pollution, but it amounts to the same thing. And of course, many countries are now embracing this challenge. In the International Nitrogen Management System, this is a program supported by the Global Environment Facility through the United Nations Environment Programme, delivered through the INI network. It's four main elements: developing tools and methods, understanding the global flows and impacts, looking into regions specifically and saying, how is the situation different in my locality, and contributing to awareness raising. And you can see here in this diagram all the different issues that fit together, including ultimately a better basis for transformational change. It's fair to say that our work is not like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in that we have to go further. We have to translate our science into action. And that also means embracing the challenge of working with you as governments and around the world stakeholders on questions like policy homes. In terms of products from INMS, there can be guidance documents, special reports. One I particularly want to emphasize, the global assessment that we're currently working on, as well as regional assessments, databases, process support. Just to say something about the science, and I show this graph purely because it's something we've been collaborating with FAO on, and I'm very happy to mention our collaboration with Amiable and colleagues in this regard. What this graph shows, the top one is the total emissions from poultry into the ammonia, into the atmosphere as ammonia. Beneath that is the percentage excreted for backyard birds, for house birds. Almost all scientific assessments until now have said it's a fixed percentage lost to the atmosphere. But this is showing that even the percentage is climate dependent. Warmer environments have more emissions. That means a warmer world has more emissions. Climate warming is likely to increase this form of nitrogen loss. That's a major challenge for us for the future. It's a science challenge, of course, as we weave this kind of scientific understanding into our assessment tools. Going forward, here's an impact. It's rather complicated, this one. This is the warming and cooling effects of nitrogen on climate. On the right-hand side, a green bar indicates that nitrogen is warming. On the left-hand side, a dark green bar indicates that nitrogen is cooling. So you've got warming elements, cooling elements. My point in this is again to illustrate how nitrogen is having multiple impacts and our science is getting to grips with these issues. If we add up all the nitrogen flows in the world, here you can see these, most of the nitrogen coming in the world is synthetic fertilizers, crop biological nitrogen fixation is going into harvests. The harvests are feeding livestock, the livestock are feeding people. Really interesting in this flows diagram, you see that only a small number, 22 million tons are going to human nutrition. Most of it is feeding livestock. And where many of us eat more livestock than we need for healthy diets, this is a massive environmental impact that could be optimized, could be reduced by tuning our meat and dairy intake to match health needs. Of course, many people need more, but others need less, and somehow we've got to optimize. So in terms of solutions, the food system is right at the heart of this. Feed crops, conversion of nitrogen into animals, the food supply, and of course, food waste, has already been mentioned. The driver of that is our food and diet choices. Many can choose, many can't, but better choices can help us. And of course, that nitrogen resource going back, the sewage, the manures, is a great opportunity to reduce nitrogen waste. Each one of those buttons is an area for taking action. It means there's not one silver bullet. Everybody has to contribute. And it's not just about food systems. Our drive for combustion, for energy, for heat is producing nitrogen oxides. At present, most of that is not recovered in any way whatsoever. So that's the challenge, to move nitrogen towards a circular economy. More circular means that we're keeping the value in, wasting less, and of course, that means less fresh inputs are needed, making a more efficient system. And of course, spatial integration and optimization of the whole system is vital. So let's get to the bottom line here. Nitrogen is affecting water pollution, climate, air quality, biodiversity, ozone is needed across all of the SDGs. We say it's everywhere and invisible across the SDGs, forgotten by everybody, but we need to remember it. The past fragmentation has really been a barrier to us. By working together, we offer multiple win-wins, which will help us make progress. That means better use of fertilizers, urine, dung, there's profit opportunities, and opportunity for societal change. The countries embracing ambition, the Colombo Declaration to halve nitrogen waste and save 100 billion a year. This is really something around which here we are, we can work together. There's going to be work for everybody to do. And of course, I would say it's not just an opportunity for investment in the circular economy, it's also an opportunity under COVID recovery. Of course, we're suffering from COVID at the moment, but the economy will be suffering from COVID for years. This $100 billion, we would like to keep that in the system and make that a contribution to agricultural innovation and a healthier, more sustainable world. And with that, I will just finish off by showing you the picture of how we're working together now as we develop with UNEP this interconvention nitrogen coordination mechanism as an opportunity to work more effectively for this halve nitrogen waste goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, thank you, Mark, for the excellent talk. I'm sure that we'll have come back to you with some questions. Thank you for your nice presentation. So I will now move on to the next speaker, and the next speaker is Mr. Amewel Wei. He's livestock policy officer in the Animal Protection and Health Division of FAO. Amewel will give us a presentation about the nitrogen emission in the livestock sector. The floor is for you.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, dear colleagues and participants. My talk today will focus on nitrogen emission in the global livestock sector. In this presentation, I will answer two important questions. What is the contribution of livestock systems to multiple nitrogen pollution threats? These threats include air pollution, eutrophication, acidification, water pollution, and climate change. And the second question, what are the opportunities to better manage nitrogen in different livestock systems? We all know that in the last 50 years, the supply of animal source food has increased rapidly, mainly fueled by human population growth, urbanization, rising incomes, but also by technological innovation, cold chain, and investment. This growth, however, has increased the amount of nitrogen pressure on the self-operating space on Earth, especially known as the planetary boundary. For instance, as you see on this graph, the emission of anthropogenic reactive nitrogen has surpassed the planetary boundary for nitrogen. Moreover, structural changes of the livestock systems have led to the disconnection between feed production and animal production. For instance, the production of industrial pigs in China rely on feed produced mainly in Latin America. Consequently, livestock systems have evolved from circular systems where most of feed is sourced from locally available sources and management of local croplands to linear systems that are mainly landless systems. And this has resulted in excessive manure discharge into the environment. But we also still see smallholders and backyard systems that coexist with those large-scale farms. And those smallholder systems, of course, contribute to food security and household income in most of rural areas. Our analysis covered 275 countries and territories grouped in 10 regions. We modeled nitrogen use, flows, and emission using an updated version of the Global Livestock Environmental Assessment Model scheme developed by FAO. As results, we find that livestock sector emits around 65 teragrams of nitrogen per year into the environment. And this is equivalent to 1/3 of anthropogenic nitrogen emissions. Most emissions took place mainly during feed production and manure management systems. But of course, you can see that the magnitude of emissions differ by country, production systems, and species. Here on this graph, we can see it much more in details. If we do a closer look, we see that most nitrogen emissions take place in some regions. For instance, the Indo-Gangetic Plain emission, they are related to high density of cattle and buffalo, and they are associated with poor, is this region here, and are associated with poor manure management and the use of high amount of synthetic fertilizer. However, if we move a little bit in East Asia, high emissions, especially of ammonia, nitrous oxides, and nitrates to the environment are explained mainly by the geographical concentration of animals in large-scale farms, especially the industrial pig, chicken, and mixed dairy cattle. And they are also related to unregulated manure disposal and high synthetic fertilizer application rates in the crop production. In Latin America, we see that the emission per hectare are mainly related to the backyard system, especially the backyard pigs and chickens, because those animals rely on scavenging, especially using the available resources. And in our modeling approach, we didn't associate those systems with land use. Looking at life cycle nitrogen use efficiency, this analysis shows that broiler chicken are more efficient. The broilers, of course, rely on high quality feed, such as cereals that are edible for humans and use high energy for the production. And of course, these contribute mainly to feed, food, and energy competition. When you look at buffalo and beef systems, we see that they are less efficient in converting nitrogen in feed into the final animal products. Those systems, they rely on non-edible grass and crop residues to produce nutritious animal products, mainly contributing to the circular bioeconomy. Of course, from these graphs, we see that there is a large variability of efficiency between production systems by countries, also by species. And this variability is an opportunity to upscale best practices in less performing systems. If we look at the international trades, the first graph shows mainly the embedded nitrogen emission in the trade of feed. And we see that in this case, mainly the emissions are mainly driven by some higher consuming countries of feed, especially China. And that is mainly due to the fact that the livestock production in China is expanding. On the other hand, we see that when we look at the animal products, the emission of nitrogen embedded in the trade of animal products, we see that most of those emissions are even related to the countries that are producing highly, especially the United States, which is a big producer and of course is the importer as well as exporter. But we see also that the countries that rely on international trade for their animal product supply, especially Japan. This analysis shows that there is a large opportunity for circular bioeconomy. For example, we analyzed the possibility of feeding food waste to industrial pigs, and we found that in all regions of the world, this strategy by feeding food waste to industrial pigs can increase highly the efficiency of the efficiency at all levels, and it can also reduce the amount of soybeans and grains that are consumed now by animals. And this reduction can go up to 31 million tons of soybean and 20 million tons of grain on dry matter basis. As conclusion, I would say that livestock supply chain are a major contribution. They're a major contributor to the global nitrogen emissions. And of course, we can see that in some part of the world where there is a high consumption of animal products, a reduction in the production and the consumption of livestock products is probably necessary. And this will have a multiple benefit on reduction of different nitrogen threats. And to do that, multi-stakeholders are important, especially multi-stakeholder initiatives are necessary, especially to address sustainable nitrogen management through technical solutions and policies. And those policies and technical solutions must, of course, consider the potential trade-off between nitrogen management and other sustainability objectives. Thank you so much. I would like to acknowledge, of course, all the colleagues that contributed to this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Amibel, for the nice talk. Now I invite the next speaker, Mr. Kim Heko. Kim is the Agriculture Officer in the Plant Production and Protection Division at FAO. And before he starts his presentation, I could see a number of people asking some of the questions in the chat box. And if you also focus, if you give the name of the presenter, I think it will be much more easy towards the end so that they can pick up those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Harmesh. In my presentation, I would like to highlight some of the points by previous speakers had spoken about. And my presentation will try to highlight some ideas that could be built on to the broader picture. So as in the introduction, Eduardo Mansur mentioned, at FAO, we are now we have now the International Fertilizer Code of Conduct. And within that framework, I would like to put some challenges in crop production that we have. I'm a crop physiologist by background, so I would like to highlight some of the challenges related to nitrogen and crop production. Of course, as highlighted, the food security in agriculture and the need of global advocacy for policymakers is a key driver in this nitrogen challenge. The scientific data, the evidence that we need to build is a primary stone that we need to build on. Here, I would start with mentioning a couple of challenges and how we can drive those efforts towards achieving some of the points that were highlighted in the 2019 Colombo Declaration into specific actions at country level. We all know that nitrogen for crop production is an essential agricultural input, but in the meantime, it's also a major pollutant. Here, when you take in terms of simple ways where you input nitrogen in crop production system, there are different ways plants respond. The most desirable way is this graph in green. When you put more nitrogen, you have a fertile, responsive and fertile responsive soils and a positive response in yield. But the challenge is that in many situations, we do also have non-responsive soils that are very poor, or those who are already very rich, do not require more nitrogen. In this matter, there are some innovative tools that can be brought to the farmers to have these NDVI tools that are in the picture. It's a way to measure the chlorophyll content in leaves and see whether the nitrogen is used efficiently. And this is a tool, scientific tool, way to actually use in an efficient way to increase nitrogen use efficiency to have from the low actual yield to a higher potential yield. In this context, as Eduardo Mansur mentioned previously, the International Code of Conduct has been endorsed by FAO after all the consultative process that was previously explained. And there is 9 key articles that try to assist the countries to use and manage the fertilizers at the farm, ecosystem, and national level, and address the issues of SDG by using judiciously the fertilizers to prevent misuse, underuse, or overuse. How is it stated? Here, a picture of how this fertilizer code tried to address the different stakeholders. As you can see here, the government and policymakers are the major stakeholder, but also the fertilizer industry. Of course, the user and civil society have a role, but there are all these other stakeholders that are put and that are all very important. In one of the latest paper just published last week, there is this idea, this framework where within the agri-food system, from a nitrogen perspective, the same stakeholders are laid out here with each of their responsibility. But as you can see here, the major impact is on this box under fertilizer, manure, crop residues, and legume that impacts the major global nitrogen loss per year. In this paper, Professor David Kenter explains how each of the stakeholders could be targeted by policies to improve the system. In the same way, the nitrogen, the fertilizer code that states the same stakeholders are aiming to the same goal. In this perspective here, I would like to address all the audience on the people who are involved in the value chain of the fertilizer sector, that we have put now an implementation plan that tries to disseminate this provision of the nitrogen code in different ways. For example, here, promoting a more holistic approach of sustainable management of the soil, nutrient, and ecosystem services. There's also a very important component on strengthening policies and environment. This document could be shared, and we could build up some common action plans to try to tackle those issues. I will not go further into detail, but provide you some key ideas that could be built on in the consultative way. In practice, of course, there are the challenges, but also opportunities when we want to tackle this problem. There are well-known agriculture practices that are known to have impact on nitrogen emission to reduce its impact to the environment. Conservation agriculture practice has been largely promoted by FAO, but there are other sustainable intensification practices, but even conventional agriculture practice, when combined with some of the newer technology, can reduce nitrogen emission. For example, use of inorganic fertilizer with reduced tillage and residue retention or manure, as Emma mentioned previously, can reduce nitrogen emission, increase the use efficiency. There are also some other alternatives, such as yield scale, greenhouse emission indicators that can also drive this kind of changes. There are multiple examples that shows that some of those combined technologies, such as combined animal manure with inorganic fertilizer, can use at yield scale, with a yield scale, methane, carbon dioxide, or nitrous oxide emission. So here, are we just talking about trade-off, or can we get synergy? That's one of the key questions that we should be able to answer. Increased yield is the ultimate target in crop production, but also there are other parameters such as micronutrient deficiency has to be tackled first by solving nitrogen limitation. There are also these mitigation factors. Policymakers could also, and the different stakeholders could be also more interested some other alternative methods, indicators, metrics to use. Usually we use this nitrogen oxide emission per area as a criteria to measure the reduction in nitrogen emission. But in terms of crop production, there are some alternative ways to measure that. As I mentioned, yield scale greenhouse emission matrix could also be a more integrated indicator, taking into account the land, nutrient, water use efficiency parameters. To end up my talk, I'll just mention some of technological way to tackle this kind of problem. Of course, in terms of crop nutrition, nitrogen is the major nutrient limiting factor. But to enhance the effect of other nutrients such as phosphorus, potassium, but also micronutrient, you need to be able to combine these effects and try to have some technological tool to assess what's the status and what's the need as to increase the efficient use of those resources, as I just mentioned. Just to wrap up this talk, I would like to highlight that this multi-stakeholder approach to halve nitrogen waste, we need some innovative solution to engage all the stakeholders that are working together to the common objective. Of course, government and policymakers are the most important in this, but also scientists, scientific data, and international collaboration, such as the collaboration that we are trying to initiate here, are very important. And using some innovative metrics, some alternative metrics to engage also the fertilizer industry to provide fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers that are more efficient, that are more adapted to the specific need of the farmers and the crop, are some of the alternatives. And the fertilizer code and its implementation plans is meant to provide such solutions and collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Now I invite our next speaker, Mr. Ronald Vargas. Ronald is a land and water officer at FAO, and he is going to give us a presentation on soils, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change. What is the role of nitrogen and carbon sequestration efforts? Ronald, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Well, a lot has been said already about nitrogen and the different issues around it. I will now focus on nitrogen, soils, and climate change. Well, as perhaps you are aware, a healthy soils can help us providing multiple ecosystem services, and definitely it has been touched upon related to the use of fertilizers, and all these are applied to the soils, in some directly to the plants, but mainly in the soil. So that's why this consideration. Well, we have many global challenges related to how we use soils and how they affect whether in the land degradation, biodiversity, climate change, food security and nutrition. And of course, we need to add the issues related to the Montreal Protocol with the ozone layer, the Ramsar and the water bodies, and of course the Colombo Declaration and all their activities related to nitrogen per se. In all of them, soils can help because he is central to many of these actions. If we talk about emissions, well, we know that FAO in reality constitutes around 24% of the global emissions, and there you can see the other sectors. And in here, we can see that crops and livestock constitute the major part in terms of all these FAO. And there we have two main emitters or gases that are nitrous oxide and of course methane and CO2. While in the others, we also see that, especially in peatlands, we also see that nitrous oxide is there. And here I'm trying to highlight the issue of crops and livestock. And here we see the details on how each sector contributes specifically. Enteric fermentation, well, Amabel already addressed this issue with details, but then we see synthetic fertilizers, the manure management, etc. So those are very important aspects that I will address now. When we come to emission, with stock and emissions, I would like to highlight that soils constitute one of the main carbon stocks in the terrestrial ecosystems. But there is degradation, and as part of the degradation, we include the nutrient imbalance, which is the underuse, the overuse, and the misuse of any type of fertilizers. All these degradation processes lead to emissions, and they are not only emissions in terms of carbon. We also have nitrous oxide emissions, methane emissions, so all of them are together and we cannot disassociate them. When it comes to the emissions, as I said, these three main gases are fundamental and they are the consequence of unsustainable soil management practices. Therefore, although we are currently working very hard in trying to recarbonize our soils, we cannot do it if we just separate carbon from the other two gas emissions. And here it comes the role of soils for food security and the different essential nutrients that the soil and especially the plant require to be in the soil or any other source. Nitrogen is fundamental and has been already highlighted. And in our left part, you can see that the main, let's say, source of nitrogen comes as fertilizers, synthetic, or there are some biofertilizers as well. But on the right side of this figure, we can see also how soil biodiversity help us to be an alternative source of nitrogen nutrient for the plants. And that's something much related to, for instance, the combination of soils and pulses in order to be a symbiosis for life by getting nitrogen for the atmosphere, right? So that's one. However, if we see the global use of fertilizer, you will see that nitrogen is by far the most used fertilizer. Some regions use it in amounts that are really going beyond the limits, and some regions do not really use that. But in here, we are including any type of fertilizer. Now, there has been a recent study in which we have the comprehensive quantification of global nitrous oxide sources and sinks. And here, the main conclusion is that we already went beyond the planetary boundary in terms of all the climatic scenarios that were done in terms of emissions. We really went far beyond these emissions. So the article is concluding that we really need to take action because not even the most ambitious scenario in terms of emissions was already passed. So we are far beyond that. And when talking about nitrogen, we need to talk about fertilizers, especially in terms of all the FAO group of emissions. And in there, we need to see the underuse, the misuse, and the overuse. And especially I will focus on the misuse and overuse, because that's the most common, there's the most two common problems around the world. The underuse is rare in very few regions, but the overuse especially is the one that calls our attention, causing a lot of soil pollution, soil degradation, soil biodiversity loss, eutrophication. We are also affecting the ozone layer. That's also represent an economical loss because we keep applying nitrogen and fertilizers, and sometimes the soil is not responding, and that's not being beneficial anymore. And definitely water and air pollution, because if our soil is polluted, all the contaminants go to the water and then to the air through erosion and many other sources. That's why soil is central to this issue. And I saw that sometimes when addressing the issue of nitrogen, soil is not considered at all. Now, we are in FAO through the Global Soil Partnership responding to the issue of the decarbonization of the economy through the recarbonization of global soils. In here, we have two main streams. One is that we are trying to avoid emissions from soils, okay? And not only carbon. I repeat, we need to find the balance between the main greenhouse gases, and those are carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And wherever is possible, we want to sequester carbon, but we also want to see how we can remove the nitrogen, although that's very challenging, and maybe the biological fixation of nitrogen help us a bit, but not much because it's so difficult. And in here, we have two paths, the green path and the carbon market path. The green path is that one that many countries are aligning to with all these UN declarations, UN commitments, in which we want to preserve the ecosystem services, we want to mimic nature, and we of course want to avoid all type of, or reduce or avoid emissions, and make our agro-food systems resilient. That's what we want, and that's the green path. But we need investment, and now with the private sector interest, there is the carbon market path. But in this carbon market path, we don't just want to focus on carbon. Again, we also want to include nitrogen. So there are carbon credits. So we want to see how we can put nitrogen also on the loop. Why? Because although we are putting a lot of efforts in adopting good practices for sequestering carbon, we cannot forget about the power that nitrogen has in offsetting maybe all our efforts of carbon sequestration. Why? Because of the global warming potential concept. If you see the global warming potential concept, you will see that nitrous oxide is the highest greenhouse gas that require attention, that stays around in the atmosphere for many, many years, and that can put under risk all the carbon sequestration efforts due to that power potential that this gas has. Therefore, in any carbon sequestration initiative activity that is taking place now, we should make efforts in order to include nitrogen as part of the equation. Otherwise, we will not be succeeding in sequestering any carbon. Now, what are we doing in order to really deal with this? We are trying to promote sustainable soil management linked to climate change mitigation, because that is feasible and we have science for that. We are trying to move the focus on carbon, but to all gases, and especially and particularly nitrous oxide. Why? Because most of the practices are related to enhancing the system, and all want to have more fertile and healthy soils. That will not be possible if we keep overusing and misusing fertilizers. Nitrogen and all the other nutrients can be in balance if we use integrated practices that take into account all available solutions, and many of them are nature-based. Therefore, we need to use them. We have the International Code of Conduct for the Sustainable Use and Management of Fertilizers that is trying to address the three issues: misuse, overuse, and underuse. We are also trying to harness a lot of soil biodiversity, because we launched last Saturday during the World Soil Day, the State of Knowledge on Soil Biodiversity, where you will find many solutions to address this issue. In February next year, we will be launching together with UNEP the global assessment of soil pollution, and you will realize how the problem is. It is huge. So we need what we know what to do. There is a lot of science, there are a lot of experience, we have networks, etc. But we need to do into action, we need to move into action now. And climate finance can help us in mobilizing resources to take action, because that is fundamental. Any nitrogen initiative can increase the mitigation potential of carbon initiatives, because that is currently happening. Therefore, I believe we really need to move into action. And for that, we of course need political will. But I think with all these examples of issues, we can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ronald. Now I'll invite our next speaker, Mr. Magesh Pradhan. Magesh is the coordinator of the Global Partnership for Nutrient Management at UNEP, and he will present on the highlights of the sustainable on the UNIA's resolution on GPNM as well as sustainable nitrogen management. Magesh, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ramesh, and it's a pleasure to send you greetings from Nairobi. I just wanted to give you a quick overview, especially in the issue of time constraints, an update in terms of where we are with the UNIA 4 resolution on sustainable nitrogen management. This is a picture of the UNIA 4 meeting that took place in March 2019, which actually adopted the landmark resolution on sustainable nitrogen management. A bit of context to take you through. We've had a number of key sort of publications, starting with Our Nutrient World. And then just before UNIA 4, we had the UNEP Frontiers report, which looks at emerging issues. And interestingly, one of the issues was on nitrogen, called the nitrogen fix. And here we had Joyce even look at the amount that Mark mentioned, 200 billion worth that is lost annually. In terms of the resolution itself, and here we had strong backing from the South Asian countries through their governing council process, and it was the government of India that actually led the adoption of the resolution. We've also had some very key partnerships globally, the International Nitrogen Initiative, and also a big UNEP GEF project, the International Nitrogen Management System, as Mark already mentioned, that have laid the groundwork for this. The resolution itself has 5 key operative paragraphs, and these in terms of policy coordination, better management of the global nitrogen cycle, coordination of existing platforms looking at multiple benefits, and then training and capacity building, as our ambassador mentioned at the beginning, and then sharing information, the awareness raising of such a complex issue. If I can take you quickly through each of the operative paragraphs. First, in terms of Intergovernmental Working Group on Sustainable Nitrogen Management, we are about 40 countries that have nominated focal points to this working group, as you can see from this list. And we had an online meeting, Zoom, in fact, it was 8th and 9th of June for this working group. 2 agenda items. One was on a coordination mechanism. As you saw from Mark's slides and presentation, nitrogen cuts across climate change, biodiversity, marine, a lot of issues. How can we have some sort of coordination? So that was put forward to the working group. The second, which is work in progress, especially through our INMS project, with report which will come out in 2022. So these were shared with our the better management of the global nitrogen cycle, or the operated paragraph 2. Again, I think the INMS project is really taking a lead on this. This Global Environment Facility UNEP project looks at different elements, from the data needs and concepts to the management practices, both global, regional quantification, as well as demonstration and verification, and then in terms of awareness, but ultimately leading to better basis for transformational change. As we've heard, nitrogen cuts across so many things, and how can we put that together? So it's a really important platform in terms of this global assessment. Another area I'd like to share with you, which is also related to the SDGs, where UNEP is the custodian agency, is on coastal eutrophication, SDG indicator 14.1.1, where we're working on an index for coastal eutrophication potential with our colleagues at IOC UNESCO. More recently, and for UNEP 5, we have been working on a presentation, or a report, sorry, on the health impacts of fertilizers and pesticides. And it's quite interesting, especially in the current context of COVID, etc., to also highlight the use of both more fertilizers, mineral, as well as organic, and their health impacts. Operative paragraph 3, and here in terms of the different platforms, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but as I mentioned, I've already talked about the International Nitrogen Initiative, INMS, but there is also in South Asia, where there's a very large use in terms of fertilizers and nitrogen footprint, a South Asia nitrogen hub, which actually met last week in terms of their contribution in the different work areas. We've heard from both Ronald in terms of the soil partnership, and we've just finished the World Soils Day on Sunday. We also heard about the livestock assessment and performance partnership that Amiable referred to. The fertilizer code, etc., give a good sort of basis for further collaboration. And here in UNEP, we have a very interesting example between the nutrient management and our colleagues at the Global Wastewater, where we had second rounds of joint collaboration in terms of how we can address this issue. The fourth operative para, and this is in terms of training and capacity building, I think we can do more, and this is where we very much welcome inputs from the 300 plus colleagues online as to what are the different opportunities. We run a couple of MOOCs from UNEP, but again, through the South Asian Nitrogen Hub, different MOOCs are being done, and the INMS project. In terms of knowledge sharing and awareness, and I think this is where a maximum amount of progress has taken place. And as you've all heard, nitrogen is such a complicated topic. We had a very interesting launch, which was strongly championed and supported by the government of Sri Lanka. It was really a pleasure to have the Honorable Minister at the opening today on nitrogen for life, everywhere and invisible. And this is where of halving nitrogen waste by 2030. Again, that provided a very interesting platform for a multi-actor dialogue. We also had, and I'm going to show you, we have a Nitro concert where we had a Grammy Award winner actually come up with a nitrogen song, and I strongly encourage many of you to please look this up on YouTube. We had an interesting report on grasping the challenge on nitrogen just before the event as well. One thing which Honorable Minister from Sri Lanka mentioned is that at the 75th session of the UN General Assembly in September, we had the head of state, the President of Sri Lanka, actually championing the cause of nitrogen at the highest level. Now, we've had several webinar series on sargassum and on phosphorus. And again, just to show you the figures, there's been a lot of interest in terms of the impacts of nitrogen and nutrients in sargassum, and also with phosphorus not too far behind. The interest in the webinar today speaks volume, and we hope that this will be in a series of webinars, which the second one, which will be hosted by UNEP and FAO after UNEP 5, the first part. My last slide is on the opportunities, and here I think there are numerous opportunities for us as the nitrogen community with the upcoming UN Food System Summit that we've heard. We also had the UN Ocean Conference that was postponed from this year. Nutrients and eutrophication have a big impact in terms of land-based sources of marine pollution. We have 2 decades that are starting next year, the ecosystems restoration. We have also the ocean science decade. And again, very good inputs. The climate change COP next year, we've already heard of the Cornubia process that was mentioned. And then on biodiversity discussions where there is a similar target on halving nutrient waste that is being mentioned. This is the slide that I started with UNEP. UNEP 5, unfortunately, in the current context, will not happen in one go. The first part will take place in February next year, more focusing on the operational aspects, but more substantive UNEP will take place in 2022. But for this UNEP resolution on sustainable nitrogen management, we are expected to report at UNEP 6, which is 2023. So we are hoping that in collaboration with all our partners and all that has been said, we can have a very good report back in terms of building political commitment, moving the needle, and doing more on sustainable nitrogen management. Thank you very much. Ramesh, back to you.
Thank you, Magesh, for an excellent overview. I think now the time is running out, so I don't want to take the time of the panel discussion. So because we have now left out with only about 20 minutes, so I would like to skip the question and answer. I have seen many of you have already given in the chat box as well as in the question and answer box. I request, I think, most of the speakers to look at this one, and maybe the organizer will collect and then post it in due course of time. And I have seen also some of the speakers are already responding to some of the questions. So with this, I have to thank all the speakers for the brilliant speech. Mark has given an overview of a global perspective, and the FAO has taken up on 3 different dimensions, on the livestock, on the fertilizer aspect, and the greenhouse gas emission, and the soil and climate change aspective. And the UNEP, Magesh has covered the UNEP resolution on nitrogen and how we move forward in achieving and also reporting the UNEP 6. And with this, I like to congratulate all the speakers, and then I will hand over the floor for the next session to Mark Sutton, who we don't need any introduction because he's already all well known to all of you. Mark, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh, and thank you for taking us this far. Now let's get our panelists up on the screen. So if each of our panelists can open their screens, that would be excellent. We have Pierre Gerber from the World Bank, Anna Englerid from the government of Sweden and chair of the Air Convention, Raghuram from India, chair of the International Nitrogen Initiative, and Isabel van der Beek from UNEP. So I hope we've got you all there. That's excellent. Thanks very much for joining us. In the interest of time, I'm going to hammer straight in with the questions, and first over to Pierre. So Pierre, tell us this. In order to halve nitrogen waste by 2030, that's a pretty ambitious goal from sustainable livestock systems. Where would you think are the big wins? Is it manure management, food choice, food waste? How far can they take us?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Excellent presentations and audience. So if we think about keeping nitrogen in the livestock value chains, in the livestock systems, I think what Aimable mentioned is quite clear, right? We have two areas of losses. Those are feed production and manure management, and two big processes of losses, which are the volatilization of ammonia and the leaching of nitrate and organic and runoff organic nitrogen. So this is quite clear where to go. And furthermore, we've seen in Emma's presentation where we have hotspots. So it's quite clear. In terms of manure and what we propose in our operations and what we support in the operations, support through the development of guides and good practices, is essentially relying on recycling. And what does that take? That takes first clearly some regulatory approaches on discharge, on application rates and timing. And it also takes some investment support in innovation, in capacities of the farmer to develop their facilities and so on. So that's the first one. On feed, two areas of work really. One is feed use efficiency, so to reduce the amount of feed we need to produce. And here we have very good examples of feed ration balancing in India, for example, very successful. And then the other part will be, of course, the production of feed. And here I don't want to repeat, I think Ronald and Heku have really presented very nicely some options there to reduce losses at the feed production. And the third one I would like to mention, which cuts across in the way that it really reduced the magnitude of losses throughout the chain, is dealing with food losses and food waste. And so it's minimizing the losses, working on packaging, we're supporting the processing industry, we're raising awareness among consumers to really make sure we have less losses. And then when we have losses, try to recycle them. So bring them back as feed in the supply chain. And I would just want to say, this really highlights the relevance of circularity to tackle those changes, those losses in the supply chain. Stop.
Thank you so much, Pierre. That's excellent. I'm going to hand over to Anna now with a question to you, Anna. And you're working on air quality. So why should we care about halving nitrogen waste for air quality? What are the specific measures needed for air quality improvement related to those air quality gases, ammonia and nitrogen oxides?
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
So thanks. Well, from an air pollution perspective, there are many reasons to care about nitrogen waste and halving it. As we know, deposition of nitrogen is a driver for eutrophication, for acidification, for loss of biodiversity. Then we have the health aspects, and that is where air quality comes in. The negative effects on human health, like nitrogen oxides and ammonia, contributing to formation of secondary particles, thus to the concentration of PM2.5, negative for human health. And further, NOx is a key precursor for the formation of ground level ozone, also harming health and vegetation. We care about nitrogen. So when it comes to measures, it is clear in our region, in the UNEP region, that we need to concentrate on reducing ammonia emissions from agriculture. And I don't think I need to repeat many of the important measures. It's about how we store and spread manure. It's about how we use fertilizers. It's about how we feed our animals, how we feed ourselves. But this is very important, and this is one of the emission reduction sectors that has been lagging behind in our region. And in this context, I have to mention that the Air Convention is about to adopt a guidance document on integrated sustainable nitrogen management. And this is a huge document that contains a go-through of a large number of measures to abate nitrogen, and this will be available from the convention website. And just a short comment on NOx as well. Once again, with a focus on our region, here important measures are those that reduce the use of fossil fuels. So very much for us, the transport and energy sectors are in focus. And it's also becoming increasingly important when we talk about NOx to coordinate with climate change policies and measures. While most climate change measures will be positive for air pollution, not all are. And I think here about use of biomass as substitute for fossil fuels, or the use of diesel cars, which will be more pollutant, especially when it comes to NOx, than petrol engines. So integrated policies and measures are needed. This is how we see it in our region. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. Very clear. So let's hand over now to Raghuram. Raghuram, you're an expert on crops and genetics. When it comes to halving nitrogen waste for 2030 from crops, where do you see the big opportunities? Is that fertilizers, crop genetics, soil management, biological nitrogen fixation, whether you're going for a GM world or agroecology? What's your perspective on the big hits?
Thank you very much. I was just trying to see if I can show you a slide, but that doesn't matter. Crop genetics and crop improvement for nitrogen use efficiency has been one of the relatively neglected areas in nitrogen use efficiency planning. We don't have low nitrogen input screening programs for in many countries for any of the major crop species. If you look at whatever is the potential for nitrogen use efficiency in any given crop, it comes from three different sources. One is the crop itself, the other is the agronomy, the soil, the fertilizer management. The third is the system of rotation, pulses, crop mix, and biological nitrogen fixation. I would consider that at least a third or even more of that would come from crop itself. All that agronomy can do is realize the innate genetic potential of the crop through optimization of practices, but eventually it hits a ceiling. So in the short term, agronomy, soil science will give you the benefits, but in the medium to long term, you have to break the ceiling only through crop improvement. For this, we need a clearly visible way of identifying an efficient variety from an inefficient variety, what we call a phenotype, which we are now developing for rice and others are coming in. Then using that phenotype, you need to have germplasm screening. At least in the last Indo-UK project, we have shown that half of the potential, genetic potential for nitrogen use efficiency already exists in the germplasm. You may not have to engineer it, it's just there. Just screen it, find it, use it. It's a very, very important thing that we need to learn. In rice and wheat, where there is a huge germplasm already, we are not using even a fraction of it for optimizing the nitrogen use efficiency. Then we need to go back to the legume cereal rotation or a legume-based crop mix and rotation that would bring down the necessity for fertilizer or manure or any kind of external input of nutrient. That's the way in which you can reduce by
excellent.
half.
Sorry to cut you off here, but that was really good. And I want to go on though, however, to Isabel from UNEP. And Isabel, you're working between UNEP closely with the Global Environment Facility and on transboundary water pollution. That's been recognized for decades. What do you think are the big contributors and how are we really going to overcome the barriers? Can't hear you. Not yet. So keep talking. No, I'm afraid only the lip readers are going to get this. So can I suggest we come back to you, Isabel, and you have a shot at trying to get your system working. And I'm going to go straight back now to Pierre Gerber and come back to you, Isabel, in a moment. So back to you then, Pierre. And this is about mobilizing for action. And Isabel's going to tell us more about that in a minute. But Pierre, if we were to prepare for this new emphasis on global management of the nitrogen cycle, you're working for the World Bank. What do you think about this new vision for something like nitrofinance? What would nitrofinance mean to support investment in the future? And what can the World Bank do?
Yeah, well, before going to things like impact finance, I really wanted to highlight the need to maybe redirect current public support that is made to the food system. It's about 570 billion that is going to the food system for public resources every year. It's about 28% of the value added of the sector. And this is not really getting the systems to evolve in a direction that we would like them. This is still letting the system generate substantial costs to the society in terms of health, environment, and economics. So let's first think about that, how we can correct some of the couple subsidies and the over-utilization of fertilizer they imply. Let's think about how we can correct price support and the overproduction they foster before going into the other resources, right? So I think this is a very important task and the bank is definitely working on that, carrying out some analysis, working with governments on that. So very important first. Now, to your question really of impact finance. What is impact finance? It's result-based finance. So we have to agree on the result, on a way to measure the result, and then we have to agree on ways to channel the resources towards who is delivering those results. So at all of those steps, we have specific questions, and we are working on those things, not necessarily on nitrogen, more on climate finance and mitigation effort in the ag sector. We're looking at the barriers. What are the barriers specific to the ag sector versus barriers that were found in other sectors from which we can learn? Because today, very little of the impact finance is going to the food system. Second, develop indicators and MRVs so we can agree on the way we measure progress and we channel the resources. And the third is prepare some pilots to show that this can be done and we can have really results if we bring in these kind of resources in the sector. So those are the things we're doing, and I'm happy to discuss it further when you have time.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And now let's see if we can go back to Isabel, see if we can hear you. Is your mic, are you on? No, we can't hear you, I'm afraid, Isabel. I'm sorry. So keep working on the system. We'll come back to you the moment you get sound. Just speak whenever you can speak. Keep your mic on and we'll know when you're speaking. So let's, for the moment then, keep going with Anna. Anna, you're chairing the Geneva Air Convention in the UNECE region. So how do you think we can get countries serious about working together to halve nitrogen waste by 2030, which is pretty urgent?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Well, if you're not visible, you do not exist, is a saying that makes sense here. So we have a communication problem. So to get countries serious, we need to succeed in conveying the message of how many areas, economy included, as we have heard, that will positively be affected by reducing nitrogen waste. And if I may go back a bit in history, the Air Convention was formed in 1979 after the problems we had with acidification, which was a visible problem. We could see lakes and forests in Europe dying, so it was visible and easy to get public support and thus the attention of policymakers. Here it is more difficult, but not impossible. And we now have an opportunity within the Air Convention, I believe, to put more light on the nitrogen issue. Our so-called Gothenburg Protocol, which is a multi-pollutant, multi-effect protocol, where we are trying to reduce acidification, eutrophication, ground level ozone, and negative health effects by putting emission ceilings on a large number of substances, including NOx and ammonia. This protocol is now up for review. And in this review, we are going to see what is next step, what is still to be done, what will we do here? And I think that here, this review offers an opportunity to focus on specific substances and sectors where emission reductions have been lagging behind. So typically NOx and ammonia emissions, especially from agriculture, as I said, in our region. So hopefully, Mark and the rest of you, this review can help make our parties, the countries that are parties to the Air Convention, more serious about the nitrogen issue.
Thank you there, Anna. Now, Isabel, there's a suggestion. If you try speaking, if you try removing your headset, it might work better without the headset. Give that a shot, and we'll keep hoping for the best. And with that, we're going to keep going with Raghuram. So Raghuram, you are chairing the International Nitrogen Initiative. How do you think scientists can be more strongly be mobilizing and working with civil society to take things forward, to be more visible?
Well, the International Nitrogen Initiative itself formed as a voluntary network of scientists 20 years ago. And all that you see that we are talking today is a result of years and years of scientific consensus building and public awareness building and intergovernmental engagement and civil society engagement through the INI. Of course, you've been chair before me, so you know it better than me, that the INI conferences, triennial conferences over the years, we've had 8 of them already, that brought out the conference declarations, which actually read like UN resolutions. They were responsible for generating a lot of public attention, governmental attention, policymakers' attention to the updated scientific evidence every 3 years. Then we had the INI policy briefs from time to time. We, of course, have the website. Then the N footprint activities, which became like a tool that anybody can play with to find out their nitrogen footprint, like the carbon footprint. And of course, the INMS, which you're heading right now, and the various media engagements that we have done from time to time for a different purpose. I was actually looking at how much media attention we have generated from the nitrogen resolution. More than 100 reports in the various media across the world, more so from South Asia because it happened to be tabled from South Asia, have been covered just in the last 1 year. And a lot of them were actually directly because we have been communicating with them continuously. We have been in education. Of course, you've been involved in also starting the nitrogen MOOC on the edX platform. So we are there in public communication and media engagement. We are there in nitrogen declarations. So we are trying to be there in as many places as is possible with all our other roles as scientists. And I still realize that we need you to do a lot more to make a difference.
Thank you, Raghuram. And if you are an NGO or any part of a society listening to this call, feel free to get in touch with any of the panelists, with Raghuram or others. I think we might have Isabel. I saw something working just now. Can you turn your mute off?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Success. It's a moment of celebration.
Wow.
And
this is stressful.
We're gonna roll, yeah, but you can relax now. It's all good. And we're gonna just push on this question of barriers to change. How do you think we can overcome the barriers to change, particularly for water quality, transparent waters in your area, but other issues? And also, what do you see as the priorities for future investment if we really mobilize society?
Okay, so the two questions in one, thanks. Yes, so indeed, excess nitrogen leads to eutrophication. We all know this. It causes dead zones. We also know that nitrogen pollution of aquifers is a source of drinking water, is also a threat to human health. And we all know that we can mostly attribute that to inefficient agriculture systems. And it's a similar story when it comes to nitrogen pollution of water bodies from wastewater sources. Tertiary treatment is not yet the norm. It's somehow the exception. Many only have basic sewage treatment facilities, and this is exacerbated. The problem of pollution is exacerbated by urbanization, also lack of significant capitals to invest in improved infrastructure. And also that is not enough because we don't also give enough attention to nitrogen recovery and reuse. So this will remain unresolved if we continue working in isolation, addressing the issues. So we need to give more attention to the nitrogen cycle. Historically as well, that's my number two. Science and the policy community have not been talking much to each other. There's little communication between experts and policymakers for rivers, lake, coastal zone, and nitrogen pollution, nitrogen air pollution, for example. And that has prevented mutual understanding of shared common opportunities for better nitrogen management. And you were asking me about the solution, and this is where the GEF project INMS for me comes in as a solution. It comes into play with a bunch of potential solutions for integration along the nitrogen cycle, for the rapprochement between the science and the policy community, because the nitrogen cycle is truly at the heart of the INMS project, which is promoting this joined up approach to nitrogen management. And it's truly a very strategic and vanguard frontline project. So from a science perspective, as you mentioned, Mark, we will have the first international nitrogen assessment, this first global assessment integrating science, practice, and policy across the nitrogen cycle. It will support international policy development. And it will also provide hotspots for future intervention. From a policy standpoint, then the project is also developing this interconvention nitrogen coordination mechanism, which is not a new convention, but it's a supra mechanism, so to speak, which integrates the work of existing convention along the nitrogen cycle. So together, this international nitrogen assessment and the inter-nitrogen coordination mechanism will support integrated management solution, and they will help hopefully countries on their pathway to have nitrogen. So if we mimic the convention process, and if income has somehow status of a convention, so to speak, because it links convention, the GPNM that Mahesh spoke about could be the stakeholder dialogue platform or the parliament for this income. And the science body of income would come in with the institutionalization of INMS, which would undertake periodic international nitrogen assessment. And the work of income would be then supported perhaps by a permanent coordination mechanism or an income secretariat. So those are just wild thoughts. So stay tuned for more updates. We are just at half them through the project. Now, how can we mobilize society?
Now we need to finish up here, Isabel.
Okay.
You can finish in a 15-second statement.
About okay.
Last words before we're going to go on to the rapid fire question in a minute. I think actually we need to do that now. So thank you very much, Isabel.
Okay.
And the last is a rapid fire question for everybody. Here we are globally. It's the elephant in the room. It's the thing that everybody has been ignoring. It's everywhere and invisible. If we're really to take this urgency seriously for planet Earth, in your opinion, what is the single most important thing to do? And I'm actually only going to give you 10 seconds, rapid fire. And so let's take you in random order this time. Anna first.
If I can unmute.
Your mic's on.
Isabel, you said it, kickstart the income. Let's make use of the conventions and policy platforms we have.
Thank you very much. Pierre.
If you had one, it would be revisit the ill-directed subsidies for energy sector on which the harbor boards depend hardly, and to fertilizer. This will require redesigning subsidies, right? Supporting still, but in a different way, the poor and those living in food insecure areas.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Raghuram.
Bring back legume rotations, subsidize efficiency rather than end use.
Thank you very much. Isabel.
A nitrogen campaign, a nitrogen revolution. Nitrogen is the new carbon. Very little is known about the nitrogen cycle, at least with the general public. They should know that they should care about it and they should know what they should be doing about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, panelists. Sorry to rush you, and I'm going to hand back now to Henning.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. And it's very exciting to see this very lively panel session with rapid fire questions and putting everyone on the spot and getting very clear answers, I think, to the many challenges that the nitrogen sector or nitrogen cascades pose. So I will not try to summarize the discussion, but I think from the discussion, it is also clear that a number of follow-ups are already being identified in the area of modeling, in the area of networking, in the area of finance. And I think the idea of circularity came clearly through, which I think is the main integrated concept that we need to keep in mind when we want to tackle the nitrogen challenge. I think it's also become clear, and that is still a surprise to many, that agri-food systems are very, very central to nitrogen flows as they are, and they play a major role. The problem is that the sources are very diverse. The agri-food systems are very diverse. And depending on what emission pathway you're having a number of trade-offs and hard choices to be made. And I think as an intergovernmental organization and science, together with science, we should try to work on identifying those hard choices that have to be made, where you forgo growth, but maybe you have a cleaner environment, and who's affected by different measures in which places, and how do they play out globally. So I would just like to thank the panelists again for their contribution. I think it's been a very rich discussion. I would like to also thank the organizers, UNEP and FAO and my own collaborators who have been working hard on this. So I would thank you very much and wish you a good day, a good evening or good night or wherever you are. Keep safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye, Mahesh.